hey everyone, it's Emily, and I'm going to do a mid-month wrap-up. So I've read 5 books so far in September, and I wanted to be able to spend more time going more in-depth about them instead of filming a super long video, taking it forever to edit, and then having a long product that wraps up all of the books very quickly. I'd much rather spread it out over a couple of videos and go more in depth. So let's get into the books that I've read so far for the month of September. So the first book that I read, I listened to on audio actually, and that was Lock Every Door by Riley Sager. So in many ways this book reminded me a lot of Turn of the Key by Ruth Ware, which I read at the end of last month and initially had very positive impressions of. I thought a little bit more about both of them as I was reading Lock Every Door. So I have some more thoughts about Turn of the Key that I'll also kind of wrap into more thoughts that I have about Lock Every Door. So to start with the premise of Lock Every Door, so this follows a woman named Jules, and she accepts a position to apartments in a very exclusive building in New York City despite some red flags during the interview. So during the interview there were some questions and some rules that she has to follow that make it very clear that this is going to be a very isolating experience for her. So she's not allowed to have visitors, she's not allowed to spend a night away from the apartment, she's not supposed to talk to anyone in the building, she's really supposed to, she isn't supposed to really talk to anyone about her experience there. It's supposed to and intended to be a very isolating experience. They also ask her, in the guise of wanting to make sure they're emergency contacts, they ask her about her, relationships. Is she in a romantic relationship? What about her family situation? Even though there are some of these red flags, she really needs the money, and so she accepts this position. She moves into this exclusive building and begins taking care of this apartment and just maintaining it. So soon after she gets there, another apartment sitter goes missing, and so most of the story is her trying to figure out what's happening, why the sitter went missing, and she starts to uncover more and more mysterious things about the apartment sitters in this building, and what's happening to them, and just overall what's going on with the building and this tenants and the way they relate to these apartment sitters. And so in terms of the creepy atmosphere, slow build up, the very domestic setting, this definitely reminded me of Turn of the Key, as I said, and also narratively, just in the structure of the book, also really reminded me of Turn of the Key, because it starts with her going to the hospital after running out of the building from the front door and being hit by a car in her rush to get out of this building. And so it kind of jumps back and forth between her at the hospital and her going, oh my gosh, thank God I'm safe, and her talking to the hospital staff, as well as her going back in time, and you get the narrative of her interviewing for accepting this position and apartment sitting. And so for both Turn of the Key and Lock Every Door, you're not necessarily supposed to identify with the main character, I'll say. It's kind of weird. Like, you're not supposed to think that they are a super reliable narrator that can make great decisions, and you can kind of get behind them as a character and the decisions they make and the actions they take. They both make some poor decisions, and I'm talking about poor decisions outside of the fact that they're motivated to take these less than ideal circumstances because of money. I don't want to imply that making decisions for yourself based on your need for financial security is a poor decision. I mean, even outside of that, they make some poor decision in terms of taking care of either the kids in the case of Turn of the Key, or some decisions about how she relates to the other apartment sitters and the people in this building in the case of Lock Every Door. But I do really appreciate the atmosphere of both of these books. They're both super slow burn books that are kind of character dives. And I do think the twist in Lock Every Door was done a lot better than in Turn of the Key. And so it happened at a point in the book where you actually were able to kind of flesh out that twist and what it meant for the characters. And I did enjoy the twist in Lock Every Door, and it made me think more about Turn of the Key and the twist in that one, and how rushed that one was, and how much I didn't necessarily like the ending of Turn of the Key. And I think I just got sucked up in both both having a really good audiobook and kind of getting immersed in that experience. But I need to separate a good narrator from a good thriller, even though listening to a thriller, that narrator is obviously a huge part of the experience. But I did like the twist in Lock Every Door, and I haven't read enough thrillers to kind of get a good sense of what kind of twists I like. I need to read more thrillers before I can kind of get a sense of that. But it was an interesting twist. You definitely thought it was going in one direction, and then it just completely shifted, and it was definitely interesting. I don't know that I was the biggest fan of the twist, but it was definitely interesting and one I didn't see coming. So overall, I definitely would recommend, if you like atmospheric, slow burn thrillers, I think you'll really enjoy this one. And if you enjoyed Turn of the Key, I also think you'll enjoy this one a lot. But I'm hesitating to give it a star rating, because thinking about these two books in tandem and reading them so close together, it really just reminded me that I don't particularly like giving books star ratings from 1 to 5. Your feelings can change very quickly as you're thinking about the narrative more and as you're thinking about the story more. It's very difficult to compare a high fantasy to a nonfiction book about climate change, to a science fiction story, to a contemporary romantic. It's very different kinds of stories that achieve or aim to achieve different purposes, and it's very difficult to kind of put them all in a same or similar scale and kind of think about them in similar ways, or kind of compartmentalize those star ratings in a way that is consistent across these genres and age ranges. Maybe a book isn't intended for an audience that's similar to you. How do you rate that? How can a rating system keep that in mind and still be consistent? It's very difficult for me to kind of put an individual star rating together and then look at how I've rated other things and then say, well, I liked this book more than this one, so that should theoretically mean I give it a higher star rating. But so point of the ramble is that I am probably going to be very inconsistent about giving star ratings. I'll probably lean towards not giving star ratings, but just telling you how I felt, telling you some things I liked, if there were things I didn't like, and kind of just giving a better sense of, you know, if you like these things in books, you'll like this book, or if you don't like these things in books, then perhaps this book isn't for you. And I think that's a lot more helpful than giving it an actual number. I mean, I think a number mostly is just useful maybe for Goodreads purposes, but anyway, rant over. So that was Lock Every Door. I also read Hidden Figures, and this is by Margot-Lee Shetterly. This is one that I drew from Fairy Loot tarot cards. I drew the tarot card for a memoir and decided to read this one. I also listened to this on audio. I checked out the audiobook from my library on Libby, and I also really enjoyed this narrator. I thought it was incredibly well written. I thought it really brought these women to life. I also enjoyed the movie, and this is obviously the movie cover, the movie edition of this book. I also really enjoyed the movie and would recommend that. But I also thought the book really brought these women to life, and I thought she did a really good job talking about the women and their life, but also talking about the science behind what they were doing in a really accessible way. So I thought that was incredibly interesting, and I thought she weaved both of those together really masterfully. So I also thought she did a really good job telling how inspirational these women were without putting them on a pedestal or only telling one side of their story, the inspirational side. They were full women who were imperfect, were inspirational, and just had full, rich lives, and were doing the best under the pressures that they were facing on all sides, whether that be from their race, from their gender, from other societal pressures. So especially in stories of vulnerable or marginalized populations, the story can sometimes only be about that vulnerability and that marginalization, pit these figures in that light, or they're the hero, and there's no in between, there's no complexity, there's no way for them to be flawed people, but also a hero. And so the stories can sometimes be told as, you know, these figures being one or the other, and I really felt like she did a good job making them full, complex people and telling that story. The story also did a great job of highlighting how important it is to be able to see yourself and see people like you in, you know, the pages of history, and not just in a footnote, but show that people like you were protagonists in stories that are important to you. So in this book, she felt it was really important to highlight that there were a lot of really amazing, incredible African American women who did a lot and were instrumental into the space race, into getting someone on the moon, and just really energizing not just a new generation of women to become scientists, mathematicians, and engineers, but also the way they related to the civil rights movement and how they were pushing for women in all parts of society to be more equal and to be able to live their own story and have their own careers or have their own life, and to be able to have that agency. And that was really, really cool, and I think she did a really good job of that. I also really appreciated that the story was fundamentally a story of hope without sugarcoating everything that these women went through and how persistent they had to be, but she still made it a story of hope. And I don't necessarily think that all stories of history have to be stories of hope. I mean, that's not the job of all stories of history, because sometimes it's very difficult or impossible to draw that hope from certain stories. So it's not necessarily the obligation of the story to be hopeful, but I did really appreciate that this was at its core a very hopeful story and a hopeful message that, you know, still really drove home what these women went through and how hard they had to fight for basic things that other people could just take for granted. Would really, really recommend both reading this and watching the movie. So I also finished the Benti series. This was another one that I drew. I drew the sci-fi from the tarot cards, the Fairy Loot tarot cards, in my TBR, and I said I wanted to finish Benti, the Night Masquerade, which is the third and final novella. They're all really short in the Benti series, so this is Benti, the Night Masquerade. And I really, really ended up also loving this third and final novella in the series. This series is just so unique and unlike anything I've ever read. And I loved a few things about it in particular. First off, I really loved the way they integrated her culture into everything that she did, but also integrated other cultures that she came across and kind of showed how she thought about things differently than other people in her society, and how that led her to, you know, accept going to this off-world university when no one in her group of people had ever left their home to go off-world like that. So she basically goes off without telling anyone and it goes to study math at this off-world, very prestigious university. So it really was just a meshing of different cultures and ideas and people, and I thought that was really, really fascinating. There's also a huge discussion and a very unique discussion of identity in this, because as she's coming across these different cultures, I'm going to try to say this in a non-spoiler way, but as she's coming across these different cultures, she's not only learning about them, but she's also in various ways literally integrating them into her body. And so there's a very interesting way this story has her integrate those different species and those different cultures that she's coming across into her very cells and into her very body in different ways for the different cultures. So I thought that was a fascinating way to talk about her as what her people call a master harmonizer, which was another really interesting part of this story, is that she is considered a master harmonizer in her people. So that's why she really, really wanted to kind of bring some different warring cultures together in the hope that they would be able to have a more peaceful future, and ultimately kind of how she navigated that. But with the changes that she underwent as she was coming across these different cultures and trying to unite them, you know, it really led to interesting discussions about her body and her identity as she's changing. She's kind of wondering whether or not she still is who she was at the beginning, and whether or not her core, you know, her core identity is still intact, and how she can integrate these changes while still honoring her traditions and honoring her people. Another aspect that I really liked about this story are the parts of the story where she really comes to realize her own power. And she starts out the story kind of very uneasy in some parts of herself, and it really was great to see her come into her own power and in some ways literally embody the symbols of power that she once thought were external to herself. But it was great to kind of see her really literally in some cases, but also just mentally embody those symbols of power and use that to help create peace across the different cultures that she's come across. There was one twist in here that I thought was really underwhelming, but that was just one minor part of it and didn't affect my overall enjoyment of it. But I really, really, really would highly recommend this whole series. So I listened to most of this on audio, but I also read Dreams of Gods and Monsters by Laini Taylor. This is the third and final book in the trilogy. There is a side novella that I'm really excited to read because it follows my favorite characters. But this is the final book in the trilogy, the Daughter of Smoke and Bone series. And I've talked about this one quite a bit as I've been reading through this series. But it follows Karou, and she is an art student in Prague. But she was also raised by these demon creatures, and she's not really quite sure what her history is or why she's been raised by these creatures. And she finds herself in the middle of a war between demons and angels. And I also want to reread this series physically because I think this, along with the Truth Witch series or the Witchland series, I feel like the audiobooks were really, really good. I really enjoyed the narrator, but I also think that I can go back and kind of get more things if I read it a second time and read it physically while doing so. Mick and Susanna were for sure my favorite characters in here. Their banter is so funny, they're so sarcastic and snarky, and I just absolutely love them. So I'm really, really excited to read their novella. Night of Cake and Puppets, I want to say is what it's called. So I'm really excited to get that as well and kind of follow their story. So as I've been reading this series, so one of the criticisms of the first one was kind of how insta-lovey it is between the main character and the main love interest. And there's kind of a reason for it, but I also thought that that relationship would develop more over the course of the series. And for various reasons that deal with the plot that I don't want to spoil, that relationship never really develops as much as I want it to. So there still is part of me that doesn't particularly like that relationship, because so it got a very quick start, and insta-love is not really something I'm a fan of. It can work and it can be okay in some stories, and I was willing to give it a shot in this one because I thought there was at least more of a reason for it than there are in most stories that kind of just have insta-love. And so I thought that that relationship would still develop over time and get stronger and stronger, and I thought I would find more and more reasons over the course of the series to love the two main characters as a couple. But that didn't really happen because there were parts where they couldn't really spend much time together, and I'm not gonna go into the reasons or spoil anything. But so that was kind of disappointing. There were a few things in this final one that are kind of wrapped up relatively quickly and not to full satisfaction for me. It's mostly small things though. And I think for the most part, the series does a good job of balancing character development with plot, but I do think there are some parts of this where the pacing is a little bit slow. I do still really love her writing style throughout the whole series. I really do love Laini Taylor's writing style, and I also love how it develops over the course of the series. It's still a very gorgeous, flowery writing style. Not overly flowery, but still a very gorgeous, flowery writing style that develops over the course of the series in a really fun way. I also really enjoy just the world. The world is so fun and so unique, and I love going between Earth and Eretz. And as I mentioned, I love the narrator, so I would recommend the audiobooks for these. I thought she did a really great job. But yeah, overall, I really enjoyed this series. I don't think this is going to be one that's a favorite of all time series for me, but I did really enjoy it. So I also read Broken Throne by Victoria Aveyard. I got a jump start on this because the first two novellas were actually in Cruel Crown, which I read for the Newts in August. I'll be sure to link that video as well. But this is a series of short stories and just some kind of bonus content from Victoria Aveyard's Red Queen world. Overall, I really enjoyed the novellas. I enjoyed the first two, as I said, in my August wrap up, and I enjoyed there were 4 other novellas in this, and they were fun. I really enjoyed the story and getting context for different parts of the world that we hadn't been able to visit before, and kind of get to follow up with some of the characters after the events at the end of the last book, and just kind of get a little bit more of their story and about what's happening after that story wraps up. I also really appreciate that in some of the bonus content, I've kind of tabbed it here at the beginning, through one of the characters who's kind of a historian and writer. So she uses that character to kind of look back at our time, essentially, and talk about climate change, which I really appreciated. So she uses these historical documents and uses that character to kind of look back at this time period and say, you know, the records show that there were huge increases in different natural disasters and different weather-related things, and overall the climate was changing and it was affecting migration in this way, it was affecting agriculture in this way, and, you know, the politicians at this time were saying very weird things about it, so I'm not really sure what to make of this, and I just really appreciated that discussion. But if you did like this series and you liked the Red Queen world, I do think you'll really enjoy these. So those are the books I've read so far in the month of September, and I'll be sure to check back in later on in the month. I definitely have some more on my list to read, but I wanted to be able to talk about these separately without making it very, very difficult to film and edit later on. As per usual, let me know if you've read any of these books and what you thought about them. How's your reading month going so far? I'll be sure to link my Twitter and Instagram down below. That's where I like to hang out. I will also link my climate change channel. I will be filming content for that literally right after this. So I don't know what order I'm gonna post everything, but there will be new content on that channel soon. So be sure to check that out as well. And until the next one, bye.